Let's talk about the Supreme Court decision that dealt with Mormon polygamy and ended up establishing America's definition of religious freedom. In 1879, in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court decided George Reynolds versus the United States. It concerned the LDS Church's claim that polygamy, as a sincerely held religious belief, was protected under America's definition of religious freedom. Yet the court decided against the Mormons, and their verdict is still foundational for American law and politics today. It's one of the foremost moments in which Mormon history is quite crucial to American history. This story is not just of interest to those who follow the Latter-day Saints, but for American law and politics. So in this video, I hope to do a few things. First, I'll provide some background to the Mormon fight with the federal government over polygamy. Two, I'll detail the case itself, those involved, the arguments that were put on display, and then finally I'll touch on the lasting issues. And if you stick with me to the end, I'll even posit my own pitch for a Broadway musical centered on the Mormon polygamy saga, in which the Reynolds decision is a central key song. And I'll give you that title of the song if you can bear with me to the end. All right, let's dig in. As I've outlined in a number of videos on this channel, Mormon polygamy went through a number of phases, both within the church and how it was dealt with by the federal government. It was practiced in secret during Joseph Smith's era. It then became an open secret during the first few years of Brigham Young's leadership. And then in 1852, the LDS Church publicly announced to the world that they were practicing polygamy, almost daring the government to come after them, but insisting that it was part of their religious belief and therefore should be protected. During that first decade or 2 decades or so, the federal government mostly obliged. They practiced what we might call benign neglect, allowing the Mormons to practice what they will, although there were plenty of clashes. But then the next phase came around 1870, when the federal government, now that they're not as distracted by things like the Civil War, turned more attention to governing those Mormons out in Utah, and especially their perverse practice of polygamy from their perspective. That led to eventually the next stage, which was the underground of the 1880s, when many Mormon leaders had to hide as fugitives from justice, culminating in Wilford Woodruff, the LDS president, in 1890 issuing the manifesto. But I want to talk about that penultimate period, the 1870s today. In 1869, Vice President Schuyler Colfax, the vice president to President Ulysses S. Grant, visited Utah to announce that they are no longer turning a blind eye to the Mormon practice of polygamy. They recognized the weakness of previous legislation like the Federal Moral Anti-Bigamy Act in 1862, which did criminalize polygamy but was almost impossible to enforce because it relied on impaneled juries in the Utah Territory that came from Mormons. Therefore, they weren't going to convict their own. And so after Colfax's visit to Utah, the legislature tried to push through a series of laws like the Cullum Bill in 1870, which would have granted federal officials the authority to impanel juries and disenfranchise, meaning, among other things, keep those who believe in polygamy from serving in juries. But those early bills were defeated, in part due to the Mormon women speaking out in the early 1870s. This is when Mormon women became some of the first in the nation to gain the right to vote. And the Mormons also pushed off a number of legislation through the old-fashioned practice of bribes, which they did in the early 1870s. But finally, the federal government locked in, and in 1874, they passed the Poland Act, which was really the next step. And that's at the moment that the LDS Church decided, all right, we need to do something to protect our right to practice polygamy. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of nerdy historical content in which I do deep dives on these topics, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives every Monday, I connect the past with the present every Wednesday, and I pull back the historian's craft every Friday, either talking to other scholars or dissecting new books or introducing you to key primary sources so that you can come to your own conclusions. And if you want to give back to this channel and make sure that I and my producer are able to continue producing these these videos, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, and most importantly, you know you are supporting public-facing scholarship. I also encourage you to subscribe to my free Kit newsletter and follow me on my different social media platforms where I do supplemental materials. All right, let's get back to the 1870s. It's at this point in the story that I should probably introduce the key player, George Reynolds, who was born in England in 1842, baptized into the LDS Church against his parents' wishes when he was 14, worked as a missionary and a clerk to George Q. Cannon, an LDS apostle at the time who was presiding over the British mission, before moving to Utah in 1865, where he quickly was recognized for his literary and organizational skills, and due to his connections to George Q. Cannon, was appointed a secretary to the first presidency. He also entered into the polygamous order and took on his second wife in 1874. It's in that year, with the passage of the Poland Act, which gave the federal government more teeth in trying to arrest and imprison polygamists, that church leaders realized we need a test case, something that can go all the way up to the Supreme Court to justify that polygamy is a protected religious right. Now, George Q. Cannon himself was arrested that year, but they decided he was a bit too public of a case. So instead, George Q. Cannon invited George Reynolds, remember the secretary of the first presidency, for a walk around Temple Square, where he was voluntold that you have a great opportunity to stand in for the faith. And they arranged with an attorney that he would turn himself in, they would provide evidence, and they would stand trial, with the goal to prove that there would not be sufficient evidence to convict Mormon polygamous men for cohabitation, which was typically the charge. Now, they eventually regretted that decision. They felt they were duped by authorities, and they ended up not really working with George Reynolds's trial. They tried to restrict the evidence that he was a polygamist. They even hid his wife until it was revealed in court. And this is such a juicy moment that I want to read from a reminiscence of one of these early players in the anti-polygamy crusades in Utah. Quote, "When prosecutors surprised the Mormon audience in court by producing Reynolds' second wife, Amelia Jane, the ghost of Joe Smith would have scarcely produced a more profound sensation. Reynolds settled himself low in his seat with a look of hopeless terror, while the general look of dismay spread throughout the entire Mormon auditory." The case was pretty simple once they had that second wife. That was clearly against the law. And so after only a half hour of deliberation, the jury found George Reynolds guilty. They sentenced him to 1 year in prison and a fine of $3,000. Now, that conviction was overthrown on a technicality, but he was then tried again the next year, and he was found guilty without any complications this time, and this time sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. And it's at that moment that the church shifted from trying to defend Reynolds by saying there's not enough evidence to convict men on cohabitation, to instead arguing that polygamy was a protected act of sincerely held beliefs, and that's why they petitioned it all the way to the Supreme Court, setting up this massive showdown that would really shape American law. Now, the Mormon case was pretty straightforward. America promises the freedom of religious practice. Polygamy was an aspect of their sincere faith, and therefore it should be protected. To defend that position during these years in 1876, the Latter-day Saints produced a new edition of their Doctrine and Covenants, which included for the first time what is now known as D&C 132, showing that this scripture, this revelation authored by Joe Smith way back in 1843, is a part of our scriptural canon, which means it is part of our sincerely held beliefs. A fascinating moment in that longer tradition of D&C 132's history. You can go back and watch my entire series on that text and its legacy. The case was argued in November of 1878, and defending the church's position was George Washington Biddle, this handsome-looking gentleman, a prominent Democrat, and considered the dean of Philadelphia jurisprudence. Now, you might wonder why such a dignified and respected lawyer would support the Mormons. Well, on the one hand, lawyers will support most things that they feel proves a judicial principle that they feel worth defending. But there are also a lot of liberals during that time who wanted to protect marginalized groups, and they saw the Mormon story as an example of that. There are also a lot of politicians, including Democrats, who were worried about the federal government under the Republican Party's control during that time was exerting too much federal power. And you can see this in how George Washington Biddle defended the Mormons in the Reynolds case. He drew from none other than the Dred Scott ruling way back in 1857, which argued that Congress did not have the authority to interfere in local matters, something that seemingly had been settled, but you can see the Democrats trying to claw back that federal oversight, which I know is ironic given the current Republican Party's positions in the last couple decades. Now, the federal government in the George Reynolds case also made what they saw was a straightforward argument. They were fulfilling, on the one hand, this was a Republican administration, remember, they were fulfilling promises that date all the way back to when the Republican Party was first organized in the 1850s, when they were trying to tear down or destroy the twin pillars of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. They vanquished slavery with the Civil War. They're now trying to vanquish polygamy. They also wanted to reassert federal power during an era in which Reconstruction is falling apart, that all these grand, massive expansions of federal power during the Reconstruction era are starting to be challenged, and this is one area where they could re-exert it. But it wasn't just the Republicans making this argument. Now teamed up with the Democrats in the wake of the bargain of 1877, the federal government is exerting more imperial power to enforce their will on these marginalized communities. And the argument worked. The Supreme Court issued a unanimous verdict on January 6, 1879, authored by the Chief Justice Morrison Waite, this dude, that argued that the federal government was invested in the public good at local levels, and that marriage was within the realm of the civic virtue, that the federal government should and was empowered to intervene, and that religious belief could not trump unlawful action. And it made this argument that allowing Mormons to practice polygamy, even if it was their sincere belief, would, quote, make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land. Government could exist only in name under such circumstances. So you can see the federal government and government power under the Republican Party was vindicated, and the Mormons were, as you might expect, crestfallen. This was the first major ruling that determined that the First Amendment rights were managed by federal rather than state authorities. It also defined religious belief as protected, but not religious action. And that framework is going to shape American jurisprudence ever since, which is why it's so significant beyond just the Mormon story. Of course, Latter-day Saints saw it as a perversion and a restriction of their rights. Wilford Woodruff, who was an apostle at that time, would later become the prophet who issues the manifesto, said that, quote, I will not desert my wife and my children and disobey the commandments of God for the sake of accommodating the public clamors of a generation steeped in sin and ripened for the damnation of hell. I would rather go to prison and to death. That sentiment was expressed by a number of Latter-day Saint leaders, especially John Taylor, who was the president at the time, who issued the famous statement that when the laws of God and the laws of the nation conflict, I will follow the laws of God. George Q. Cannon, who was still the territorial delegate from Utah and was also in the First Presidency, tried to make more constitutional arguments saying that this Supreme Court decision was a violation of constitutional principles. And so both sides doubled down in the wake of the Reynolds decision. The anti-polygamous legislators pushed forward with increasingly strict laws, eventually the Edmunds Act and the Edmunds-Tucker Act, and Mormons practiced civil disobedience, rejecting the law and eventually becoming fugitives from justice. But in the end, this was a story of the rise of American imperial power, using the strength of the government to marshal and control the lives of these marginalized groups, whether it be through the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Dawes Severalty Act, the end of Reconstruction civil rights laws, and of course with Mormons and polygamists, showing that the federal government had the power and interest to intervene in everyday lives, enforcing what they see as moral values. But we also need to touch back on George Reynolds. Remember, the guy who started this whole case, or his case was started for him when he went on what I'm sure was a very awkward walk with George Q. Cannon. He, now convicted, he had served a bit before that final conviction, but now he completed his tenure in both Utah and Nebraska prisons. He was released in January 1881. He then became a very popular author, including with several scriptural history books that he authored while in prison. And to show that he was not repentant, he married once more, taking on his third plural wife. And by the time he died in 1907, here you see him with some of his family, he had 3 wives and 32 children. Notably, the year after his death, 1908, one of his daughters, Ethel, married none other than Joseph Fielding Smith, an apostle at the time who would later become an LDS president, to show that this Reynolds family remained deeply embedded within the LDS hierarchy. A few lasting legacies that I think are worth touching on. First, I've already mentioned how this sets a legal precedent that still shapes American jurisprudence today, that you may have the right to believe what you want, but you don't have the right to practice it, and that the federal government was the final arbiter to determine those First Amendment rights rather than state and local authorities. And this notion of religious liberty, of course, remains a through line in Mormon discourse, although it takes a fundamentally different approach. In the 19th century, when they're using it to defend their practice of polygamy, religious liberty was all about protecting minority rights and enabling inclusion of these marginalized groups. But once Mormonism becomes embedded in the religious right in the American mainstream, religious liberty is now invoked as a principle that they, as a mainstream powerful organization, do not have to grant concessions to these marginalized communities. So you see how this religious liberty is flipped, which is also part of a larger story of the co-option of religious liberty laws by the religious right, but that's a topic of another video. If you want to learn more about this fascinating case study, I have a book that is one of the best books in American history on this topic. Sarah Berenger Gordon's book, The Mormon Question, Polygamy and Constitutional Conflict in 19th Century America, is the model historical monograph that I strongly recommend. And if you want the broader story, I'll also mention my book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, which places this as one moment in a much larger debate between Mormonism and the American nation. And since you made it to the end, here's my pitch. If there's ever anyone out there who wants to do a Hamilton-style play on Mormons in the 19th century, similar to Hamilton, you can have the culmination, like in the Reynolds pamphlet of the Hamilton play. The Reynolds decision is the turning moment. I don't have the skill nor the talent or the interest to write that play, that free verse myself, but someone give it a try, and I'd love to see it in the comments. Anyways, I hope you found this video interesting. If so, hit the like button, share with others so we can broaden the conversation. History has never been more relevant than it is today, because it's these moments from the past that shape the world as we experience and cast a long shadow that we still feel a century and a half later.